Welcome to Contradicting the Cosmos, the show where I refute the YouTube atheist, the Cosmic Skeptic. In today's episode, Mr. Cosmic is going to assert that morality is only subjective, not objective, and completely fail to provide any rational justification for that belief. Let's begin.
Going to jump in here for a second. You can't disprove atheism. Atheism isn't an active belief system that can be held up to scrutiny like organized religion can. Can you disprove people who don't believe in unicorns? You can't, because that's not where the burden of proof lies.
You can indeed disprove people who do not believe in unicorns by showing them a picture of a narwhal or a rhinoceros, both of which are unicorns. And he tries to make it about shifting the burden, but I just disproved the disbelief in unicorns, and I did it by fulfilling my burden of proof. Atheism is a belief, but even if you want to try and use the definition that it's a lack of belief, you're still proven wrong to lack belief. You have no excuse to lack belief, because morality is objective.
You say why?
Why?
Well, in order for evil to exist, good must exist. But in order for good to exist in an objective sense, God must exist.
Now, how many times have we heard this argument? For good to exist, God must exist, because for good to exist, there must be some kind of objective starting point for morals to be based upon. And therefore, because good exists, God must exist, right? Wrong. You've made two errors here. Firstly, although it's probably correct that there does need to be some kind of basis for objective moral truths if they exist, I don't see why this would need to be a god, and I certainly don't see why this would need to be a specific god, for instance, the god of Christianity.
God would have to be the objective source of morality, because there is no other possible option for objective morality. And in order for you to argue that there is, you would have to believe in objective morality, which you don't.
Secondly, you're assuming that objective moral truths exist, which, if you ask me, they don't, and they can't. It doesn't make any sense. Firstly, you say this.
In order for evil to exist, good must exist.
Which is absolutely true in the sense that darkness can't really exist without light, because they'd be indistinguishable and undefinable. But then you say this.
But in order for good to exist in an objective sense, God must exist.
Who said anything about talking in an objective sense? So what you're assuming here is that the evil that people refer to when they try to criticize the idea of an omnibenevolent God is objective. Whereas I would argue that it's absolutely not. When we talk about evil concerning the criticism of the supposedly all-loving God, we generally categorize it into two types. Firstly, you have the natural evil, which are things like earthquakes, and secondly, you have the man-made evil, which are things like murder and rape. As for the first category, things like earthquakes, tsunamis, and plagues, we have to understand that the only reason that we perceive these things as evil is because they're harmful to us as humans. Now, of course, this worked fine within the religious narrative for years, because according to these narratives, humans are the sole purpose of the universe. This is why I can imagine that it came as a bit of a kick in the teeth when we realized that humans are far from the sole focus of this universe. You see, now we know that not only is the vast majority of this universe completely uninhabitable, like I mentioned in my last video, but also we humans have existed for the smallest, briefest, imaginable amount of time in comparison to the age of the Earth, let alone the entire universe. So my question to you is, do you really believe that these natural disasters are intrinsically evil or not? Because if you do, then you have to explain how these things were malicious before humans were around to experience them. And by extension, is the volcanic activity that's happening on Io as we speak evil? Can you justify that opinion even though there's no humans there to experience it? I don't think you could. And that's because the reason that we regard these things as evil is because they harm us.
Mr. Cosmic is begging the question again. Humans were around in the first week that the Earth existed, in the first week that the universe existed, and humans existed before natural disasters existed, at least on Earth. And since this is a discussion about morality, the topic of natural disasters is irrelevant. They may be called evil, but they are not evil in a moral sense. So in trying to claim that morality is subjective, the first thing you do is equivocate on what evil is.
Bearing this in mind as we move into the second category of evil, we need to think for a moment about why things like stealing, rape, and murder are morally wrong. I think it can be sufficiently argued that the morals of human activity are entirely subjective. Now to this, in order to try and prove God, people will often say, well, you know that rape is wrong, you know that stealing and murder is wrong, but where do you get that from? What do you base that upon? there must be a God. But to that, I simply say that we've had millions of years of social evolution, not to mention the moral principles that have been ingrained in us since we were children by our parents and teachers, and that this is what led us to have our moral beliefs today. And we're not only talking about evil here, these same arguments can be said for things like kindness and empathy. When our ancestors were living in tribal conditions, being able to empathize with other members of the tribe led to more loyalty when it came to defending each other against attacks. What this means is that the life of this tribe would be preserved and go on to reproduce, passing on its moral teachings about empathy. And so fast forward a few generations and we arrive at today, where we as humans experience this seemingly inexplicable emotion of empathy. And because it's so difficult to explain why we feel these emotions, people would often look to the heavens for an answer. But these things can actually be relatively easily explained through completely natural processes. And because we've had so long to pass down these morals from generation to generation, although these things aren't objective moral truths, they may as well be, because they're so deeply ingrained in us that they feel as though they are. And this is precisely what I think leads to the illusion that these things are actually objective moral truths, and therefore there must be some kind of basis for them, in other words, a God.
And here is the crux of his argument. Never mind the fact that evolution is false on its own terms and could never produce empathy in the first place, this would lower all moral objections or arguments down to an appeal to emotion. If morality is not objective, then you have no foundation on which to say anything is wrong. Let's say the government decided to pass a new law that said stealing is now okay and lawful. Would you agree with that? Assume for the sake of argument that it doesn't contradict anything else in the Constitution. Would that law be moral? If morality is just subjective, then on what grounds would you argue against it? If you try to argue, we evolved to not steal, then the people who wrote the law could merely say, well, now we evolved to steal, because evolution is just change over time, and now we've changed to accept a thief's way of life. If it were evolution that ingrained morality into us, then evolution could outgrain or ingrain morality out of us.
So evil doesn't disprove God, because you wouldn't even know what evil was unless good existed, and you wouldn't know what good existed unless God himself existed. Because God is the standard of good.
Again, I really don't understand this idea that if objective moral truths did exist, there must be some kind of basis. Although it's probably correct that there does need to be some kind of basis for objective moral truths if they exist. Therefore, Christianity is true, therefore he exists. How do you know the nature of what these morals are based upon? How do you know that it's a God? How do you know the gender of this God? How do you know that your God is the right God? So yes, this may be an interesting, if flawed, argument, but all you're arguing for is the existence of some kind of basis for these morals. This holds absolutely no bearing on whether this basis is an omniscient God, and certainly no bearing on the nature of this God and which religious doctrine he or she prefers.
I'm getting flashbacks to rationality rules now. Now, I'm sure there is a way to argue for Christianity with the moral argument, but obviously the video that Mr. Cosmic is responding to does not have enough time to go into that, and I am not prepared to go into that. Regardless, if you do not accept objective morality, then it's pointless to argue about what the basis for objective morality would be. It's like two people who were born in a cave, and one says to the other, "Hey, I found an exit to the outside." And the skeptic says, "There's no such thing as exits. Every door we have is an entrance. And even if you found an exit, what makes you think it goes outside? If you don't believe in exits anyway, why do you care about whether or not it goes outside? It being an exit at all should be enough for you. And then, when you use it, you can discover if it goes outside or not."
It doesn't disprove God. It may prove there's a devil out there, but it can't disprove God. Now, we can ask a lot of questions as why would a good God allow evil to continue? And that's what we do in the book, Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case. So if you want to go much deeper into that topic, you can.
Okay, there's pretty much two ways to explain away why an omnibenevolent God would allow evil to happen. Firstly, you'll often see people argue that God simply works in mysterious ways, but this is unsatisfactory because you're so certain when good things happen that these things are attributable to God and God's plan. If your favourite sports team wins, or if a relative survives some kind of disease, you thank the Lord and you just know that it's because of God that these things happened. Yet when the tables are turned and your sports team doesn't win, or when your relative dies, oh, well, God works in mysterious ways, right? We can never understand him. No, it doesn't work like that. Secondly, you'll often hear people argue that life is just a test. And so when a tsunami comes and wipes out an entire generation of innocent children, well, they're just on a first-class ticket to heaven. To which my response is always, how dare you? How dare you trivialize the suffering of countless human beings across this planet by attributing it to your God's mysterious ways? It's insulting to the families, to the friends, and to the memories of the innocent people who perish in natural disasters. Trust me, if the God of the Old Testament exists, I don't think he cares as much as you think he does about your earthly well-being.
God working in mysterious ways is a very simplistic way of putting it. God is sovereignly managing every atom in the universe, while simultaneously allowing us to have free will. Simply saying God works in mysterious ways does not do him justice. Also, I'm not sure what Mr. Cosmic is saying doesn't work like that. In both examples he gave, the person clearly believed that God was responsible, sovereignly responsible. Not directly responsible, but sovereignly responsible. So saying it doesn't work like that really doesn't make any sense. It is ultimately God's choice who lives and dies. He can either allow you to live or allow you to die. And then there's the non sequitur of saying, actually a double non sequitur, of saying first that sometimes it's a test, therefore tsunamis, therefore all children go to heaven. If the tsunami is a test, nobody on Earth is going to know about it, except maybe the person being tested, and even then, they won't know until much later. And depending on how old the kids are, yes, some of them do have a first-class ticket to heaven, but only because God chooses to. He is under no obligation to take anybody to heaven, not even the unborn. And how dare you?
How very dare you?
Trivialize the suffering of countless human beings across the world by saying they're just unlucky, just in the wrong place at the wrong time. It is insulting to all of humanity to say that life ultimately has no purpose. And as for that question at the end of the clip, yes, God knows the result of every test before he does them. The test is not for his benefit, at least not directly. God knows who will love him and who will not, and he knows how to accomplish that outcome. But I believe it is fair to say that there is, out of all the infinite possibilities of choices, no outcome where everybody is saved. So God manages the butterfly effects to save who he wants to save. To skip the test of life would be to deny free will or freedom of choice. And many people don't make that choice until after they've gone through some sort of trial that causes them to realize their need for a savior.
The main point here is evil can't disprove God because evil requires good and good requires God.
Again, here's the point to drive home to people who use this argument. Good only needs God if objective moral truths exist, which they don't.
In fact, C.S. Lewis put it this way. He said, the shadows prove the sunshine. In order to have shadows, you have to have sunshine. Oh, you can have sunshine without shadows, but you can't have shadows without sunshine. You can have good without evil, but you can't have evil without good.
No, it doesn't work like that. Yes, evil can't exist without good, but good also can't exist without evil. In the same way that light can't exist without darkness, and darkness can't exist without light, because you wouldn't be able to even define them. A shadow can't exist without sunlight, because it's caused by sunlight. Darkness isn't caused by light, and light isn't caused by darkness. It doesn't work in the same way.
Now, it is very tempting to agree with him on this point, but do not be fooled, it is wrong. It is true that dark cannot be defined without light because its definition is the absence of light. But light is not defined as the absence of dark. Here's a few definitions of light. The natural agent that stimulates sight and makes things visible. A source of illumination, especially a lamp, decorative illuminations, traffic light, the first one's best. So you can very easily define light without the existence of dark. If you needed both good and evil in order to define each other, then any definition you come up with would be arbitrary. You would have no ultimate standard by which to compare them. So he's trying to make morality relative like motion is. Motion is relative based on whoever's observing the motion. If you throw a baseball, from the baseball's perspective, you're the one moving. But we are able to judge that movement because we have a standard. We know what zero is, and we have the maximum speed, the speed of light. So if you want to say morality is relative, you would still need some sort of ultimate standard by which to judge it. But that, of course, makes morality objective. Also, to go back to that motion being relative, which I brought up, not the Cosmic Skeptic, so don't accuse me of strawmanning him. Motion is only relative in terms of who's doing the moving. When you throw the baseball, you and the baseball will be in agreement that you are moving away from each other. So if you do try to compare morality to motion, keep in mind that will be a false analogy if you're trying to say they're both relative.
Evil doesn't disprove God. It actually shows God exists.
I do see this argument crop up all over the place, but it always relies on the fatal assumption that objective moral truths exist. And to elaborate on why I don't think they do, I was recently reading an interesting philosophical thought that if oxen were to imagine gods, those gods would probably be in the form of oxen. If cats imagined gods, their gods would probably be cats. And if cows imagined gods, their gods would probably be cows. And if these cows developed religions, their religions would probably tell them not to kill other cows because it harms the species, in the same way that we feel that we morally shouldn't kill other humans because it harms our species. Yet if you think about our moral compasses, we kill cows all the time, because not only does it not harm us, it actually helps us in the form of eating meat. And so to me, this is just further proof that morals are entirely subjective to the consciousnesses that are judging the right from the wrong.
So now he offers a philosophical hypothetical as proof. And he does it by a very subtle begging the question, too. Because he says, if these animals imagine God, as if God is imaginary. So he's already assumed his own worldview in order to pose this hypothetical. Secondly, God does not command us not to kill because it harms the species. He commands us not to kill because we are made in the image of God, and God is not a murderer. Animals are not made in the image of God. And once again, if morality was subjective, then you could not judge the difference between what right and wrong. You could only judge the difference between what you like and what you don't like.
Think about it, this can be used to explain why, despite the fact that there are some morals which are pretty much universal amongst humans, some of them have much more blurred lines. Think about issues such as abortion. Think about issues such as homosexuality. The reason that these moral discussions have such blurred lines is because people aren't quite sure if they harm humans or not. In the case of homosexuality, for instance, a lot of people can't make their minds up as to whether the rights of homosexuals are infringing on those of heterosexuals. Of course, I don't believe that they are, but because of that blurred line, it leads to a moral blurred line. And with abortion, the big debate is always, is a zygote a human being? If it is, then by having an abortion, you're killing a human and therefore harming our species. And if it's not, then you're not. And again, this is just a moral blurred line caused by the fact that morals are entirely subjective as to what harms us as a species. And all of these things lead to the logical conclusion that there are no such things as objective moral truths.
The moral issues he's talking about are not because people are unsure about their position. People who are unsure about their position do not get into heated debates. Homosexuality is wrong and immoral because it is unnatural, and God specifically called it an abomination. And homosexuality does do harm, but the greatest harm it causes is a spiritual harm. Also, the rights of homosexuals infringing on heterosexuals, that is not accurate. But that's cutting a little close to political talk, and I don't do politics. As for abortion, advocates for abortion a lot of the time know that a zygote is a human, and they just don't care. But are you going to tell them they're objectively wrong if the zygote is a human? What about after the baby's born? Are you going to tell the mother she's wrong to kill the child? On what basis would you tell her that she ought not kill her baby? Since you believe morality is just subjective anyway, moral blurred lines do not come from subjective morality. They come from people not wanting to be moral. If morality was subjective, then morality would be arbitrary. Morality is not arbitrary. Therefore, morality is objective.